Continue. And I think best thing would be just to hand over to you, Ed, because you will be chairing the next session.
Thanks very much, Gal. It's delighted to be here. Ed Slipo from Northern Ireland. We have three speakers. We have Doreen. I'm going to let you introduce themselves so I don't mispronounce her name. Doreen, you're going to be talking about the dynamics of stress experience of students. Stavrola, you're going to talk about the burden of how self-compassion and forgiveness can be healing for the family. And Una, you're going to talk to us about family counterculture from Canada. Three interesting talks. So like all the other talks, 15 minutes for the presentations, 5 minutes for questions, but I'll try to follow chat if there's questions coming up. So Doreen, if we start with yourself, let you introduce yourselves and get started.
Yes, thank you. Can you see my screen?
Can indeed.
All right, that's good. Hello, everybody. My name is Doreen van Namen. I work and live in Rotterdam, in the Netherlands. And today I'm going to talk to you about a part of my PhD research. It's called the dynamics of stress experiences of students with relatives with addiction problems. It's part of a longitudinal qualitative study. And the topic I'm going to talk to you the topic I'm going to talk about today is not published yet, but in stage of it's already submitted, so hope it will not take long. Yes, can you already also see the slides moving?
Yep, we can indeed, Doreen.
All right, well, of course I want to give credit to the team, Gera Nagelhout, Hein de Vries, Anneloes van Sta and Sander Hilbrink. So today I'm going to talk to you about these research questions. How does the stress of young adult AFMs affected family members evolve over the research period of 3 years? And what causes stress to increase or decrease? So why do we focus on stress? Because stress research generally focuses on the consequences of stress, on strain. And in our research, we wanted to study the element stress for itself. And one of the interesting things of a longitudinal study is that it gives us the opportunity to study changes, and in this case, changes in stress over time. And understanding the nature of chronic stress, that is important because chronic stress is a risk factor for the onset and the progression of a range of physical and emotional problems, such as cardiovascular diseases, cancers, anxiety disorders, depression, burnout, and also for accelerated aging. Chronic stress also negatively impacts study success, which can have serious consequences for young people's career opportunities, and also in that way affect their lives. A little bit about the method. A diverse group of 30 students participated in longitudinal qualitative research, which lasted 3 years. 93% of them participated in at least 2 interviews and 80% 3 or 4 times. In the last interview round, 24 participants drew a stress graph. So they scored their stress levels from the first interview in 2019 to the last interview 2 years later. They scored it on a 10-point scale and explained in interviews why their stress increased or decreased. So we distinguished 4 patterns of stress. Stress remaining stable, high or low. That was true for 3 participants. Stress increased over time, stress decreased over time, and stress had erratic highs and lows. The gray lines are the individual entries and the red lines are the averages. So this group of 3 participants shows stress being stable, with 1 person drawing a stable stress line at 10. so at the highest level. And 2 scored a relative stable low line. This is the group of 5 participants with stress increasing, 10 participants with stress decreasing, and 6 lines from an erratic pattern. And even though the overall trend was up or down in 2 patterns, each participant drew outliers, sometimes small waves and sometimes larger outliers. And an important finding was that stress could also be high when there was no contact with their relatives or when relatives had died due to addiction. And this, so both groups, no contact or death, this was true for 1/3 of the participants, so 8 of them. A little bit more about the participants. 14 were women, 10 were men. At baseline, their mean age was 22.5 years. They had 95 relatives with addiction problems with a mean of 4. And in their nuclear families, they had 12 fathers, 10 mothers, 1 stepmother, 3 stepfathers, 11 siblings, and 4 partners with a mean of 1.7. Most relatives were poly users, and in almost all cases, alcohol was present. 21 of our participants had mental health problems, 17 had physical health problems, and 19 had sleeping problems. And before or during the interviews, 1/3 of the participants was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. We found several reasons for stress to change. The reasons for stress increase were aggression, incidents or accidents, performance and work pressure, informal care duties, and the standing up coping strategy. 2 main reasons for stress going up or down, so both were possible, were related to treatment, recovery, and relapse of the relative, and were intimate relationships. And stress going down was related to good quality social support and withdrawing coping strategy. The coping strategies and the support theme, I will not elaborate on today because I wrote 2 articles about it, and yeah, the information about these themes is enough for a presentation in itself. So that's why I don't use it in this presentation, but of course there's a lot to tell about it. And also the impact of the COVID pandemic is not included in this presentation for the same reason. So we wrote a separate paper on the impact of COVID. Most participants experienced or witnessed physical or verbal aggression. Some participants had multiple relatives who developed addiction problems one after the other. So after distancing themselves from the problems of one relative, they were again confronted with the addiction problems of another. And as a result, stress peaked time and again. So this young woman says, history repeats itself. Now it's my sister. She has children and she now uses drugs all day. Same poor coping strategy as my parents. She abuses her oldest boy physically and verbally. She tells him she wants to kill herself. It just keeps going on. Most participants experienced incidents or accidents. There were minor incidents like not showing up at an appointment or phone calls from drunken relatives, and these called mild stress peaks. There were full incidents inside and outside the home, drunkenness with abusive behavior. Drunkenness with abusive behavior during a party. Arrests for driving under the influence. Traffic accidents or near traffic accidents. And that caused extreme stress, like this example from a woman of 25 years. My father was stone drunk. while we were driving, he pulled the handbrake. Most participants experienced stress peaks due to performance pressure during study projects or their graduation phase. And some participants who graduated during the research period and were now young professionals experienced work pressure. And they said this stress had a direct link with addiction problems in the family. Because in their lives, participants had often received insults and humiliations from relatives who said, for example, that they were worth nothing, that they would never achieve anything. And at times when they had to perform, for example, when taking a test or acquiring an internship or graduating, tensions ran high. Because they had become convinced themselves that they were unable to complete these tasks successfully, that they were not good enough. Like this woman, she said that pressure, she graduated during the research period and was a young professional. That pressure, the responsibility, the stress, it was way too much. One day I just quit without having a new job. That fear that I couldn't do it, that I'm not good enough, keeps coming back. Some participants had informal care duties. They cared for their relatives with addiction problems, from intimate personal care to support in the process of recovery. They cared for the household, for other family members, such as younger siblings, and they sometimes took over financial obligations. And when obligations piled up, it led to peaks of stress. So, for example, the combination of informal care and a graduation phase could cause stress outbreaks. Like this man, he said, I now have to do all kinds of things for my sister. But I'm in the process of graduating now and I don't have time for it. I get all stressed when she reschedules appointments on short notice. Then I also must reschedule my appointments. And she doesn't ask her friends to help her. She has no problem asking me. When I have a lot on my plate, it feels extra stressful to help the people around me. Of 6 participants, the relative entered treatment and had a period of recovery followed by a relapse. When the relative entered treatment and went into recovery, the participant's stress immediately decreased. But the moment the relative relapsed, and that happened in all the cases, the participant's stress rose rapidly. So that was one of the examples for stress going up and down. So this young man, 24 years old, talks about his brother. The first year of our study, my stress was the highest. Then my brother was full on in addiction. When he went to the clinic, my stress went down. And when he relapsed, it went straight up again. Now he's clean again, and I've very little stress regarding his addictions. And also romantic relationships could cause both increases and decreases in stress. Entering a romantic relationship usually triggered stress. Growing up in a family where addiction was present often meant for participants that the addiction came before everything and anyone else. This made many participants feel that they were not important enough for their relatives and possibly not important enough for others in general. This affected their self-esteem and their self-confidence. And these experiences negatively influenced their sense of being worthy of love and feeling safe in intimate relationships. This young man described this situation. A relationship is super stressful for me. In my first relationship, I saw my girlfriend as a mother figure. I wanted her to be the mother I didn't have. I started to behave as a child right away. I became submissive and I made myself small. And that led to all kinds of problems and a lot of stress because she didn't like that and I didn't know how to behave differently. I find it very difficult to be with someone and be close to them.
During another couple of minutes, I'm afraid.
Yes, I'm almost done. Breaking up could cause a decrease in stress. This woman broke off her relationship with her boyfriend with addiction problems and says, I think because I got rid of all the nagging, I feel better. From arguing every day and thinking every day, am I good enough? All that lying, always being on my guard. I don't have all that now. I feel much more relaxed. So, a few notes to conclude. Participant stress was highly dynamic. Stress experiences were long-lasting and could be triggered even in participants whose relatives had died or with whom contact had been broken off. We found no one-to-one relationship between patterns and reasons for stress to increase or decrease. So the reasons for stress to increase and decrease, we found them in all the 4 patterns. And we think it's important to identify reasons for stress to increase and decrease for AFMs themselves and also for healthcare and educational professionals to help AFMs cope and manage their stress. Yes. Am I within the 50 minutes?
Absolutely, Doreen. Well done. Well done. Excellent presentation. Thank you very much. And I hope for everyone that's sparked a few questions. I know I've got one, but I'm going to shut up and give people the floor. And let's see, show of hands. Any thoughts for Doreen or questions? I'm going to kick it off, and because there was a clear question in my mind. What so many of those young people talked about was trauma, very, very serious trauma.
Yes.
And it really spoke volumes to me that unpredictability when certain stressors in lives were reintroduced, well, they revisit their stress responses. So, I think what you said, when people get good support, stress goes down. Looking after their own needs, stress goes down. And that workforce out there that can be supportive of these young people, how much they understand. I'm just wondering your thoughts on how important it is for them to understand a trauma-informed way of working.
Well, most of them did not get good quality support, especially not from professionals. They were more positive about informal support. They were rather positive about educational support. So actually, I was a little bit surprised about that. But there was even one young woman who said, well, she owed her life to her teachers. She said, without them, I don't think I would still be alive. Oh. And they cared for me. They looked for a place where I could be, where I could find help. And yeah, so most of them found the most helpful support they found in their own environment. And they were least satisfied with the professional help. But yeah, again, I can fill another presentation with support experiences.
Yeah. I mean, that's quite powerful. And Richard, it brings back what you said in Risk and Resilience, that so many young people find teachers unbelievably supportive if they know how.
Yes.
So maybe that's an area for work that the teachers know. We're not asking them to be social workers, we're asking them to be teachers, but good caring teachers, which a lot of them are.
Of course, to get help from teachers, they have to be able to share some of them experiences with the teachers. So it starts with that, of course.
Room for one final question, and then the next talk is going to clearly link into what Doreen talked about.
Well, I'll just come in just to say, responding to that, but also responding to Dave's and Tina's comment. Is anyone providing good quality support? Please share. And I think the answer to that is yes, there will be many people providing good quality support. The issue is how well, in a positive sense, it's institutionalized. It's down to individuals, and there are huge numbers of individuals who provide wonderful support, but organizations which are ostensibly out there to provide support for affected family members or for children often don't provide it across the board in the way that one would hope that they could do and should do. And I think this point you were making, Ed, about the sort of risk and resilience work is absolutely right. I mean, it doesn't, in a sense, it doesn't matter who there is for you as long as there is somebody for you.
Yes,
and that's the most essential point that came out of the resilience work that Jim Orford and I did all those years ago. It's having somebody, and that can be and often is an influential teacher, but it doesn't have to be. It can be a neighbor. Obviously, ideally, it's a parent. And that links in with some of the stuff that we've heard from at least two of the papers so far today about how yeah, I've lost where I was going with that, so I'll stop as it's time to move on to the next person.
Okay, Richard, thank you for that. And Dorian, thank you very much. And it leads so nicely into Stravola. I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name, but you're going to be talking to us about the role of self-compassion and forgiveness. Now, there was a question, support for the non-using parent, family member. Yep. Okay. So I'm really excited to hear what you have to say about self-compassion and forgiveness. Oh, yep. You're muted, I'm afraid. If you could unmute yourself.
All right. Yes.
There we go.
Yes. Yes.
Easy done.
Excuse me. I will share again. Okay. We're fine then. Huh? Okay. Thank you very much for your presence and sharing. I think the two presentations next to each other are a very good match. I work in a family department, drug treatment program, part of the psychiatric hospital in Athens, and we provide psychoeducation and counseling directly to affected family members and anyone who has a meaningful relationship with an adult person struggling with addiction of substance use, problematic gambling, eating disorder, and internet addiction. Significant others come first to our department 2 to 5 years after having realized the problem. The way they speak for their loved one reflects their relationship. They refer to them as the child constantly and speak in the first plural person for his action, for his responsibilities. We went to the program, we called the lawyer. Their child is an adult, but is taken care as a child, cleaning up his room, preparing his meal, calling his therapist to justify his delay. They perceive their well-being directly related to how their loved one's life turns out. If he's sober, I'm okay. Tell me, what can I do to save my child? They express as if only the addicted needs help. As if this traumatic experience has not done any harm to them. They experience a heavy burden of blame from every direction, even from the one that they try to save. They question their role all the time in this situation. They self-doubt because they have tried so many times with so many different programs, but nothing got better. They evaluate it as a failure. They say, I have tried everything, nothing changed. I have abandoned my life. My parents grew old. There is no way out. They have internalized the stigma. They may assume responsibility for the addiction and believe that they somehow failed for everything. This trap of a blame cycle can lead to resentment, guilt, and a sense of helplessness, isolation, and strained relationship. Self-blame perpetuates shame. We often encounter significant others that they are thinking of themselves as unwanted, unworthy, inadequate. Shame may be long-rooted to past traumas that are re-triggered. Early life experiences in their family of origin interfere with their ability to stand up for themselves. Feelings of loneliness resurface and accompany them for the rest of their path. Their inner resources are already insufficient. Their own attachment history influence how vulnerable they are to the vicious cycle of not being good enough. Layers of shame have built this harsh inner critic that sabotages motivation. They withdraw, resign, or surrender. It may be a way to protect themselves against the risk of hope. The therapy is felt judgmental. They say to the therapist, "You may be tired of me, haven't done what you've told me." Or, "What can you say? You've been hearing all these stories again and again." Or, "I don't think you can understand me. You don't love anyone with that problem." These are examples of how their unwanted parts, their ashamed part, threaten every relationship they have. Shame is not a problem, but avoiding shame, it is a problem. We need to detect shame and to know how sometimes our traditional techniques might sustain it. For example, the confrontation strategy and the overuse of cognitive strategies. Shame implies perceived lack of power to meet the standard of one's ideal self. This discrepancy implies a good-bad dichotomy. It's different from guilt. Guilt means I made a mistake, while shame means I am a mistake. It can be so difficult to ease this emotion and prevent setbacks from our clients. Since they are coming, there is a side in them where hope still grows. They need time to feel reconnected. As Chris Kermer has taught, shame is an innocent emotion arising from the universal wish to be loved. He says that recognizing this opens the door to self-compassion as an antidote to shame. By understanding the dynamics at play, the therapist shows the path to stand against the aggressiveness of addiction, to navigate the challenging emotions. The family therapist transfers the hope by showing empathy and understanding by reflective listening. Yet little is known about intervention targeting stress and negative self-judgment among caregivers in addiction. So how can we overcome these therapeutic obstacles and help significant others break free from self-blame, shame, and self-criticism? By reducing stigma through psychoeducation, but shame goes beyond. The proposed framework here encourages to integrate self-compassion and self-forgiveness in the counseling process for affected family members. Based on neuroscientific evidence, Gilbert developed the compassion-focused therapy, CFT, for people with high levels of shame. Self-compassion is conceptualized as a social motivation that starts from treating oneself with warmth, encouragement, and support. When we are able to be gentle with ourselves in the midst of shame, we are more likely to reach out, connect, and experience empathy. It can be thought as a coping strategy that assists one to remain emotionally balanced when in a stressful situation. It's the antithesis of a distorted negative beliefs about the self. It allows individuals to see themselves clearly and wholly without the protective nature of the ego that can distort self-knowledge as a defense mechanism. According to Neff, self-compassion consists of three main components: self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. A large body of research shows that self-compassion is one of the most powerful and protective factors for mental health and well-being. Self-compassion interventions seem to regulate shame, to work for parenting interventions, enhance the quality of life of informal caregivers of people with mental problems, and treat addiction. There are 3 studies that have tested the effectiveness of self-compassion for families that I have found, at least. Self-compassion is not self-care, but gives permission to care for oneself. The Center for Motivation and Change suggests in Beyond Addiction book that self-care extends from damage control to building a life. They have developed a coaching program called the Invitation to Change approach, where the closing portion of the ITC group weekly meeting entails a moment to encourage a self-compassion practice for the coming week. When we introduce to our clients the concept of self-care and self-compassion, they hear it with surprise, some with relief, and all of them with hope. This is the answer that they haven't heard, that they haven't tried yet. While they are counseled, they describe that this is the hardest part for their work, to build their own coin of safety, of joy and autonomy. They are called to find their self again, and this struggle is meaningful. But when we talk about self-compassion, there are also misconceptions that emerge. Some people think that self-compassion means some kind of self-misery, or that it is a bad self-centric attitude that may harm their family. Others believe that their self-criticism helps them to function properly and not to do the same mistakes again. As we said, people are coming to achieve a specific goal, to help their loved ones. There is an ongoing plan tailored to their needs to maximize the chances. They are counseled to communicate those conditions that may inspire their relatives. Self-compassion teaches the clients to focus on ways that one can improve one's life, even though this goal may be a long way off. It teaches the family how to be kind and supportive to itself as they go through this process. Family might understand its own emotions and limitations with more empathy. It's important to recognize and validate their own grief and anger towards themselves. The second strand that we suggest for working through blame is self-forgiveness. In addiction literature, cultivating forgiveness toward others or toward self is hypothesized to resolve feelings of anger, guilt, and shame, respectively, that may cause relapse. Making amends, admitting wrongs, etc., are fundamental practices of AA. Family with addiction finds it difficult to forgive each other. Self-forgiveness is an emotional regulation skill that allows grief process. Self-compassion meets self-forgiveness in the realization that all humans are imperfect. It's not about pardoning or excusing or forgiving and denying, forgetting and denying. The self-forgiving person lets go of the negative feelings towards oneself and replaces them with positive emotions, such as empathy, compassion, gentleness, and love of oneself. The 4 stages of self-forgiveness process include confronting self, holding yourself responsible, confessing your flaws, and transformation. This dialogue is a self-focused dialogue one carries out through thinking or a dialogue with another person. They need to gain a more objective point of view of what they have done or not have done. This concept can also be associated with the serenity prayer that is widely used in the AA programs. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things that I can, and wisdom to know the difference. This prayer teaches members the wisdom to distinguish one from the other, acceptance. Thank you very much for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you. Right when I was about to say you have 2 minutes left, brilliant timing. That was
Thank you.
fantastic. And you linked so closely to what Dorian talked about, because how many of her students said, I'm not good enough? And now I'm following chat. If there's any questions, I know I have loads for you around self-compassion, but let me open it up to our audience and use chat. Hands. I'm afraid I can't see hands with everyone. But I will start with it. Here we go. There's a question. I can't see who raised it. So go ahead, whoever raised your hand.
Yes, thank you very much for this brilliant presentation. I was wondering at the level of the primary prevention, I mean, in the community, we know that it's not only about addiction, substance use disorders. How do you implement this concept, at the level of the community? Do you have programs to, teach people how to be compassionate with themselves, among themselves, etc., before they start, having some behavioral, disorders or addictions? Thank you.
I work in the addiction treatment field, and I don't have much experience on the prevention programs. I think that they have that self-compassion may play a central role to prevention programs too, because it's an engagement strategy for parenting interventions. But I can't answer your questions clearly.
But I think you've raised another really important question, because, and Chris Germer, who's one of the leading, leaders in self-compassion, would clearly say the amount of benefit you get is linked to the amount of practice, the amount it's used. So how do we keep this going? How do we introduce it, but encourage it both? And you talked about giving people self-compassion goals or tasks through the week. That would be one way you talked about it. I will mention we have an online, and drop me an email and we'll send you the link to the online self-compassion, because once you get it started, how do you keep it going? But you've also raised a really important question in terms of not just for family members, but also recovery, because research out of Harvard Medical School was saying 2 weeks of self-compassion on a regular basis strengthens the link between the amygdala and the cortex. Whoa. But keep that practice going for 8 weeks. Those pathways get cemented. So, and Jeffrey Foote, the power of AFINet workshops or conferences, Jeffrey Foote, when he was over at a conference 2 years ago, self-compassion is part of his Courage to Change program. So I think we have a lot to learn of the power of what self-compassion could give us, both for folks with alcohol and drug problems and gambling, but also family members. So, folks, time for one or two more questions. Richard, I think you had your hand up.
As usual, yes, I did. I waited to see if others went first, but I'll just jump in. I just wanted to congratulate you, Sylvie, on just a very, very interesting, very nice presentation. I love the way that it linked in so well with Doreen's. I also love the way that you introduced the Invitation to Change program that a number of people are do a lot of work with. We've got two people here, Dave and Tina, who run Invitation to Change groups internationally from England and are members of AFINet. And of course, as Ed was saying, and as you were saying, self-compassion is a very important part of the whole Invitation to Change program. I thought Marie-Helene's point about prevention, I think, is really important. Often we come up with really important ideas about which are very useful in the therapeutic space, but actually would be even better if they were rolled out more widely into society in general. And it's just a pity, it seems to me, that people have to develop quite serious problems to be seen. Very small numbers of people get seen therapeutically, when actually, if we could change the way that some of these skills were taught more generally, then maybe fewer people would actually come through to the treatment services. I don't know what you think about that.
Yes. Yes. Yes, it's true. Mhm, mm. I think that self-compassion extends to all the addiction field with great applicability. And it's all matters to have a conscious acknowledgement about one's feelings and thoughts. So it's maybe a path to go through.
Hmm. And maybe to finish this off, because we're moving to our last speaker, because really interested to hear about
Thank you.
the family. But thank you very much, fascinating. And maybe the final thing to say, Christian Neff, again, one of the leaders in self-compassion, would say this. It's really hard to teach self-compassion to kids because they just roll their eyes and say that's another thing adults are planking on us. Best way to teach it is to model it. So I think you've raised a really interesting, concept that we all can take a page off this book. Una, last session in this bit, and you're going to be talking about. I've lost my notes, but you'll tell us what you're going to talk about.
I'll tell you. Thank you so much, Ed, and thank you for the opportunity to present today. Please bear with me while I share my screen. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we are.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Great. So my name is Una Saintemont, and I am an associate professor at Toronto Metropolitan University. I'm going to be sharing findings from a national study that we did. And this presentation is Family Counterculture and Addiction in Canada. So I'd just like to acknowledge my team. They've been involved in this research process, my co-investigators, as well as the research staff. We've been fortunate enough to receive federal funding from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. Similar to Doreen, this work hasn't yet been published, but we're in the process of submitting our manuscript. Approximately 1 in 5 Canadians will meet the criteria for substance use disorder at some point in their lives, and yet comprehensive and timely addiction treatment remains limited. Despite rhetoric that addiction is a family disease and evidence supporting the positive role that family members play in caregiving, affected family members are systematically excluded from formal treatment processes, often due to policies and practices. For example, privacy laws in Canada and other policies that are person-centered. Several recent reports have identified significant gaps between those who could benefit from treatment and those who actually receive service. A national report on substance use and treatment in Canada estimated that as few as 10% of individuals with substance use disorder receive appropriate treatment, leaving affected family members to navigate the complexities of addiction outside the system. The lack of support not only exacerbates caregiving demands for affected family members, but also reinforces isolation, conflict, and disease burden for individuals and their family members. As a result, affected family members seek networks and develop connections against the rejection of stigmatizing narratives, often propagated by mainstream neoliberal health policies. So this paper or presentation today looks at family addiction counterculture that emerged from drug policies and other health practices entrenched in stigma. There's a small body of literature that highlights the systemic structures that shape care work for affected family members. This list here is not comprehensive as there's other papers, but some important concepts we draw on in this study are the notion that while families on one hand play a central role in their relative's illness, they are also responsibilized for their recovery. Meaning that they are expected to often play a significant role in linking their loved one to recovery. And yet there's a lack of support, visibility, or voice in this provision of care. This places affected family members in a unique and often undesirable position of having a great deal of responsibility without supportive public policies, resources, or treatment systems. And despite these challenges, many family members demonstrate resilience and solidarity, though often at a significant psychological, emotional, and financial cost. These studies highlight the need for greater awareness surrounding addiction and its impact on families. So this study was co-designed with a community group called Families for Addiction Recovery. We used participatory action research, a qualitative methodology, to critically examine how Canadian policies and practices shape affected family members' care for their relatives with substance use disorder. We used semi-structured, in-depth interviews that we conducted between February 2024 and August 2024. So this presentation is hot off the press. Ethics approval was obtained by me, the lead author of this work. We used purposive sampling. So we used recruitment flyers that were recruited through Families for Addiction Recovery, as well as 8 other community groups. Prospective participants were provided with study information that detailed all the study procedures. Interviews lasted between an hour to 2.5 hours and were conducted via Zoom. We chose Zoom because Canada is so vast, and we wanted to look at differences across provinces. Interviews were audio recorded and transcribed verbatim. Preliminary analysis began while data were still being collected and shared among the research team. A more comprehensive data analysis was then conducted using a framework put forward by Laughlin, Snow, and Anderson, whereby initial codes and memos were identified within the data, and eventually more focused codes were brought to the data set. A coding dictionary was created with in collaboration with VAR, our partner, and shared with the research team to enhance consistency in coding. Verbatim quotes were presented anonymously, and all the names have been replaced with a respondent number. All identifiable information has been removed. Some sample characteristics. So as you can see from the table, most participants in the study were parents of children with substance use disorder. A little over 80% were mothers. 62% of the sample were mothers who discussed their relationship with sons, while only 20% of mothers had daughters with substance use. I just want to remind you that this was done with affected family members, but we collected some proxy data related to their relative. That's why you're seeing the relationship in parentheses. We had about 6 fathers participate in the study, some siblings, and then other relationships. It's important to know that all affected family members in this study were tied to some kind of a community organization simply via recruitment strategy. So they all had some kind of connection. These were not parents, primarily parents who were isolated or without any access to support. You'll see that most of the participants were women. Most were from Ontario, a province in Canada. The mean age, the vast majority were between the age of 60 and 69. We had a very high number of participants who were had attended some form of higher education. Most, or just under half, worked full-time, and about a third of the participants still lived with their relative with substance use disorder. Just a little bit of proxy data. So most of the participants described that their loved one had a mean age of onset around 15. For the vast majority of participants, the onset was in adolescence, but they were their children were adult children at the time of interview. 72% reported that their relative had a formal diagnosis of a concurrent disorder, and as you can see, there were cannabis was used, opioid stimulants. Despite this, most of the participants said that they weren't entirely certain what substance was being used, and polysubstance was common as well. So the term counterculture gained popularity in the 1960s and was synonymous with radical and anarchist movements that rejected conventional social structures, conformity, and tradition. The study of countercultures closely related to subculture theory, a formation of alternative social groups that define themselves in opposition to the mainstream. So Mark Hughes argued that the counterculture emerges when social groups live outside of one dimension. Counterculture is usually characterized by the opposition to societal ideals. For the purpose of this study, counterculture refers to the alternative values, beliefs, and practices exhibited by affected family members living outside mainstream addiction policy. This presentation explores how affected family members manage their care for their relatives with substance use disorder. So this conceptual framework was developed to visualize the overlap in the characteristics that are exhibited by the family members, and I'm going to explore each one separately. So unlike members of any other subculture, most of the affected family members in the study initially aligned with dominant cultural values. Several participants held professional roles such as law enforcement, healthcare providers, which reflect their adherence to mainstream cultural values. However, over time, many, though not all of these family members came to realize that their familial work existed outside of and often in opposition to addiction care systems. Affected family members described their struggles with traditional institutions of power that theoretically are meant to support and protect them. While these were not always in direct or overt conflict with these institutions, they often found themselves needing to bypass or navigate around them in alternative ways, which often came at a personal cost to them. Two institutions that were primarily identified were law enforcement and healthcare. Several parents described taking extreme measures to avoid involving law enforcement, fearing that their relatives would be criminalized, harmed, or stigmatized. Many family members believe their relatives' behavior stemmed from untreated illness, and this conviction made them feel unjust for their relative to receive criminal charges. They saw the situation as avoidable. For affected family members, they described feeling abandoned by healthcare. Many participants expressed deep perplexion for the lack of intervention for their relatives and felt that they were often blamed, ostracized, and excluded. One mother who was undergoing cancer treatment herself questioned why addiction care was not more publicly available. Some of the alternative lifestyle that emerged for family members were in response to the abandonment and rejection of the prevailing norms. Family members described tensions with the dominant system, and these tensions led to this lifestyle. So the first one was resigning to chaos. And this is not to suggest that all family members did this, but that many did. In this case, the mother talks about bringing a prisoner in her own home and just accepting that this is the new state with her son. Another alternative lifestyle that emerged was the rearrangements that families made to accommodate the new life outside of the system. This mother talks about how her and her husband had to stay in a hotel while they left their son to create damage in their home. Another common lifestyle adaptation that occurred was workarounds. This mother talks about how she put air tags in her daughter's shoes, and this was to be able to track her while her daughter lived in an encampment. Other parents talked about buying their kids bus passes to be able to track them. Some family members talked about the desperate actions that they took in order to accommodate this life outside of the system. So one mother talked about having to take her daughter to the US to receive treatment because she felt that the policies and practices in Canada were not going to save her daughter's life. Another father talked about taking his daughter to Thailand and then ultimately settling in Panama because of poor policies in Canada. So on the other side of this was a creation of a new distinct identity and community. These lifestyles led to parents having to reclaim enabling. They felt that when they did harm reduction work, It was called enabling, but when harm reductionists do harm reduction work, it was part of a system. This mother said, now I can pay drug dealers by e-transfer. Furthermore, they became agents within their own system. So rather than relying on police, this mother talks about how she checks her son for drugs at the door, and she sets boundaries in place. So this study examined, I'm nearly done, Ed, forgive me for rushing at the end here. This study's examined how affected family members of persons with substance use disorder engage in counterculture that operates on the periphery of formal institutions. The findings of the study highlight how family members, while initially adhere to dominant cultural norms, eventually find themselves being rejected by or in rejection of traditional systems of addiction care. And this typically happens over time. For many, the counterculture evolved as a trajectory whereby they experience the tension and rejection from mainstream policies and develop new lifestyles. Through their navigation, they learn that mainstream institutions like law enforcement and healthcare were either ineffective or counterproductive to the complex needs of their relatives with substance use disorder. Emergent from this realization was an alternative lifestyle. And unfortunately, this came with an over-reliance on them and their capacity to sustain care, knowing the extent of the consequences. So for many affected family members, they were in favor of decriminalization of substance use and felt that their children had an illness and should not be criminalized. Furthermore, because they felt their children had an illness, they often felt that criminal behavior stemming from addiction, things like petty theft, explosions of violence at home, were preventable. Despite this, many had concerns about public safety. In terms of public health policies, inaccessible treatment in Canada was an enormous barrier, either by way of wait times, costs, or reliance on the relative to be ready for treatment. In Canada, families go to extreme efforts to compel their relative to be ready to receive treatment, but that window is very small and the availability of treatment is so restricted that they're unable to make it align. Harm reduction is designed to fill the gaps and keep people safe until they are ready. However, family members struggle with the waiting period because it's so high risk. Many family members wanted something more upstream that would disrupt the pattern that they've been living in for decades. Okay, I'm going to end it there. Thank you so much. I just want to leave some time for questions.
Una, absolutely fantastic presentation, as all three. And what you talked about really brought home, when I first got introduced to the work of AFINet, and that's 20 odd years ago, and Jim and Richard and Larda, and the blame and responsibility put on family members, but that emergence of alternative lifestyle just reminded me, families are caught between a rock and a hard place. They do the best they can with what they've got. But Jim Warford said, when we were doing a little bit of work on how we reach family members, he raised a question. How do family members create, an identity that, that they can own? And I think you've raised some interesting questions that, how can family members do that as a movement? So open that up. Any other questions for Una? There's one that, here we go, Gallus.
Yeah, yeah, thank you very much. I found this really interesting, but I was also wondering how these, first of all, usually countercultures, especially political ones, in my impression, more or less are a kind of, active and voluntary choice, while I think your family members were rather, forced into reactions. Some people might, might call something like enabling or the like. So I just wonder, how did these family members felt regarding their choices? So how was their level of strain? Because I think quite a lot is more or less also a kind of, trying to avoid severe harm from someone they're attached to, but still, I don't know, being in a kind of like a hamster wheel or something.
Thank you for your question. Yes, I think that it's not like traditional, punk rock kind of anarchist counterculture where there's a choice to reject. Most of the participants, would describe themselves as law-abiding, very much part of the system, the mainstream. They identified as sort of agents of mainstream culture, and yet they found themselves in a situation where they're forced to reject it because it just did not align with their situation. And there was a lot of outrage for the system that was inadequate and not allowing for them to provide care to their loved one, and they didn't understand why there wasn't more services available, why people would be so left to feel this rejection and isolation on their own. And so that's why, because it's a participatory action study, there was a coming together of community, and there was an exchange of sort of knowledge on the outside of the system. So families started to connect with each other and say, you have to take them out of Canada. You have to bring them somewhere where they can actually get, especially when they're young and under 18, because the treatment is so poor, and there's just not any way to keep them in treatment. And the lure of the substance is so strong. So
Thank you.
Thank you.